Fresh inflation data finally gives Aussies some hope. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Branko, who's been taking a deep dive into yesterday's inflation numbers for us here in Australia and seems quite upbeat about how it's all turned out. How are you going today, Branko?
Yeah, good. Usually I'm the guy that's negative, but in this situation, I want to talk about how a bit of sensationalism by the media and some of the headlines, and I'm actually on with the positive kind of outlook. So
You could have knocked me over with a feather. Well, I was very surprised when it was the positive outcome out of this. I thought, oh, because yesterday I was talking to Alex a little bit about it, and the number had just sort of come in, and it seemed quite negative. And I'm like, Branko's on the positive. I need to get to the bottom of this,
yeah,
because you usually are on the negative side of those things.
correct.
So
Correct.
let's start off. Can you just talk about what the data actually showed and really dig into that point that you're making, that it maybe wasn't as bad as it first seemed?
Yeah, so pretty much we did see an inflation rise 3.6 to 3.8. So on the surface, all the headlines are like, oh, massive inflation, blah, blah, blah. How bad is this? But in reality, and this is quite a common theme, this was actually slightly under expectation. So really this comes as no surprise. And then the big giveaway as to why this is actually a positive thing was that the Australian stock market finished up 1%. So it closed at 1% yesterday, higher. So obviously there's a reason why, it moved that way. And that's because it was slightly under expectation, they now expect, and there's some data on that I can get into, where that a rate rise isn't on the cards, and that the next move is actually going to be a rate decrease.
And that's really interesting, because we did see it take off quite a bit after that data point. And I think a lot of people were probably caught a little bit off guard by that, because they went, oh, a higher headline number, bad, but it ended up being quite good. And I'm very interested in your take on why the Reserve Bank is more likely to hold here when you see that higher inflation. Is it to do with what is within the numbers themselves, like when you look a little bit deeper beyond the surface number to the components, or how are you looking at that?
Yeah, so I think an important point here is that we've had quite a few successive months of higher than expected inflation, and they've raised rates previously when it wasn't anticipated. So that kind of movement is why now they're reversing, because they've already done those rates in the past few months that they weren't kind of expecting. So now they've kind of, in those rate rises, they've kind of priced this move in. And that's why it makes it unlikely that we're going to see any rate rises in the future. And then also I'll try and find the data that shows that it's a lot less likely. Yeah, there was some data that came out that basically, like, the prediction markets make it now that the most favorable or most likely outcome is going to be a rate decrease. And usually those prediction markets are pretty accurate. So I think that, it's, again, the sensationalism is something that I find quite fascinating. And I think that's just to get headlines, get people drawn in. But in the reality, given that we were under expectation, a rate decrease is more likely than a rate increase now. And a rate decrease is now priced in for February. So again, if you were to ask Australians 6 months ago what they wanted, this wouldn't be the ideal outcome. But if you asked Australians last month, this would be probably, an upper echelon outcome that we would have wanted.
Sure.
Given
So
what had
it,
happened in the past few months.
so it really is relative to what's going on at the time, which makes sense. Like, obviously, the outcome itself is how we're going to interpret that is dependent on expectations. Yes. I get all of that. Do you think that there's potentially political fallout, however, because you've got the Treasurer really coming out pretty heavily on the fighting inflation side of things, arguing that that's really important. If people who the layman on the street isn't going to necessarily understand the intricacies of what we're talking about here, and if they're going, well, inflation's still high and we've got rate cuts or delayed action from the Reserve Bank on interest rates in trying to bring that under control, does that put pressure back on the government here?
Yeah, I think there's a few interesting parallels here with what other countries have kind of experienced. So firstly, I want to point out that Jim Chalmers sent out a tweet basically outlining that obviously he wants to outline the positive here, and that is that it's the sixth consecutive quarter of lower annual true mean inflation. And obviously they want to promote the positives of this report
Mm.
because it's going to help them in the next election. I think one thing that's very interesting was when in the UK they had, I think this was about 2 months ago, they had like a great inflation data came out, and then they called for an election like the next day. So I think it's very common, and we see this in the US as well, where anytime kind of Bidenomics shows positive results, they want to kind of push that out. And so I think we're going to see a similar thing here where any slight positive outcome in the CPI data, the current establishment's going to push that. And then potentially, maybe even if it gets really good, actually call for an election based on that, which we saw in the UK a couple of months ago. So I think that governments will obviously use it to their advantage. And in saying that, Liberal Party has plenty that they can kind of say, look how bad this cost of living crisis is. They can play the opposite. So both parties will use it to their advantage, and I think the hope would be for the current party that the data continues to get better, and they can actually use it to springboard an election campaign.
And I can absolutely see that happening. And that's the difficulty when you've got data that's not clear, or you could interpret more than one way because, it could be bad, could be good, could be whatever. Do you think something that's playing on my mind is that the Federal Reserve has made it quite clear? We saw that this morning with the chairman there coming out and saying very likely that we'll get those cuts that were expected in September. If you could argue that Australia really can't be out of step with what's going on in the rest of the world, particularly what's going on with the Federal Reserve. So, in some ways, it's like we operate independently, but
Yes.
they would be of the same thinking that, well, we can't really be raising in an environment where the Fed and other central banks are cutting. Are there big differences between us and the US in this environment that we really should be acting more independently, or is it all really the same thing after all? So, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting point. So, because Australia started their kind of rate increases at a later stage than most of the developed world, we're now stuck behind them. So we're like the
Right.
only G10 nation other than Japan that had an expected rate increase as their next decision prior to yesterday. So it was us and Japan that were very different from the rest of the developed world. And I think a key point is that because we rely so strongly on our housing market, that the RBA was a bit didn't really want to increase rates when maybe they should have.
Mm.
And as a result, we're now feeling the consequences of that decision by being kind of behind in our rate cutting curve. And like you said, the US basically said that a rate cut was on the cards in September. And, for us, it's looking very differently. And our inflation and cost of living crisis is quite bad. So I think Australia's probably managed it poorly. And we should, in theory, be on the same path as these other developed nations, but we aren't because of the decisions in the past that continue to haunt us.
That is really interesting because that was almost seen as a positive. And I mean, I kind of remember even commenting on that at the
Yeah.
time. It was like Australia was waiting to see what everyone else was doing and delaying, and then that ended up biting us in the backside, as we were behind the curve and playing catch up and then overshot, and all those things happen when you're not ahead of what's going on or really don't have your finger on the pulse. Do you think, probably this to wrap it up here, do you think that there are some lessons that Australia should have learned here, that we should approach this slightly differently in the future to address the imbalances that occur? What's your sort of summary take on what the Australian approach should be going forward?
Well, I think one good lesson here is actually that there is like a first mover advantage with
Right.
this macroeconomic kind of thinking. If you're the first actor to make a good decision, you're going to reap the benefit at a higher level. I mean, even going back to COVID and, those that were able to, I mean, the obvious example is the economies that were able to kind of increase rates when it was needed at the start early. And because Australia now waited and we were too patient, we are paying the price. So I think there is a big first mover advantage. Obviously, there is the odds that, you might make a mistake. But, I think to fully reap the rewards of the decision, you need to be a quick actor. And we weren't a quick actor. And I think that that's probably a big lesson. And I think moving forward, we should look to make fast, quick, calculated decisions. Obviously, that's kind of easy for me to say in my chair. And at the time, I think we were probably all happy with just waiting patiently. But given what has happened, I think there is a big lesson for us that a first mover advantage is imperative. And a good example would be those that move into precious metals. Like obviously now would be, with gold up 1% yesterday,
Yeah,
it's kind of a
massive
first mover
moves.
advantage there as well in terms of given the chaos. And, if you like draw a bit of a parallel, right? If you wait for um like a big event in that gold moves up, like if you wait for Russia bombing Ukraine, or if you wait for Israel Palestine situation kind of developments there, you're too late. But if you kind of have that first mover advantage and you can kind of see the turbulence before the big event, then and you make the move, then you obviously do very well. So it's a big lesson both for the government and also for the individual.
Yeah, and that I haven't really thought of it through that lens, but you're absolutely right there that the countries that have the correct assessment of what's going on and make those bold decisions on the basis of that, they do benefit. And we can see that, you can see that reflect in things like the Aussie dollar.
Yeah.
It's getting pummeled at the moment, looking at it on my screen, down
Another,
from where it was, and that really is a reflection on getting it wrong. Like
yeah,
it comes down, it does affect you at the whole country level if you make the wrong decisions, as it does at an individual level, if you miss the opportunities.
I think another good example actually of Australia being quite too patient in their decision making was lockdown even. Like we were so late to get out of lockdown and to kind of remove COVID restrictions compared to other countries. So I think that's another example where we could have taken more initiative and probably looking back could have done better there too. So yeah,
Mm.
learn.
All right. Well, there's lots of little lessons in there, I think, about thinking from a country or a broader perspective about being having the right data and really acting on that data and not necessarily just waiting for someone else to move first. So yeah,
Yeah,
really, really interesting discussion today. I always appreciate these. So thank you for your work on that, Branko.
no worries.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.